In this unit, we turn to the English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and we'll see him as the beginnings of a truly modern political thought, a truly modern way of thinking about law and justice, of thinking about the nature of political society, the nature of the human being, and the nature of the human good. But before we turn to Hobbes, let's think of the way that the world was transformed by the fall of the Roman Empire. The world that we've been exploring is an ancient world. It's a Mediterranean world, built around the city-states of the ancient Mediterranean that are united into a great empire under the power of Rome. But that great empire, with its traditions of law, with its traditions of classical philosophy, would eventually fall. In the 5th century, the Roman Empire, particularly in the West, is torn apart. And in its place, we see the beginnings of the medieval period, the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages are a different world. The ancient cities cease to be such great, enormous centers of civilization. The ancient schools, with their traditions of philosophy going back through Plato and Aristotle, will cease to exist. The Roman Empire itself is dismembered and replaced by new kingdoms. The ancient traditions of the city-state, with its free citizens, ruled under law, are replaced by a world of kingdoms whose subjects are ruled by a sovereign monarch, who live according to the customs of their people. And all across Western Europe, kingdoms displace the Roman Empire, the Frankish kingdom, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And kingdoms are the basic political structure of what we call the Middle Ages. This only begins to change in the period that we call the Renaissance. The Renaissance means the rebirth, and indeed it is the rebirth of classical antiquity. And it has its roots in Italy. In fact, in the renascent city-states of northern Italy. City-states like Venice and Genoa and Florence, where the traditions of civic life, of classical thought, are revived. And in the city-states of northern Italy, we see the revival of a kind of civic republicanism that is characteristic of the Renaissance. And the civic republicanism of the Renaissance is most powerfully expressed in the political thought of people like Niccolo Machiavelli, author of The Prince, but also author of the work known as the Discourses on Livy. Machiavelli, one of the most important political thinkers in history, is probably more famous for The Prince. But in fact, in some ways, his other great work, the Discourses on Livy, are just as, if not more important, and certainly more reflective of why this moment is of such crucial importance in political history. Machiavelli writes a work that is an extended commentary on the first 10 books of the history of Livy, the Roman historian who wrote the history of early Rome, the history of the monarchy and the history of the early republic. And Machiavelli writes a commentary on Livy. We've said that Livy, though he's a historian, is in fact a great political thinker. Livy is one of the most important republican theorists. Livy understands that libertas is self-government, that the res publica is the public thing, a commonwealth. And Livy's history is really a political analysis. And Machiavelli's analysis of Livy makes explicit, and in fact elaborates upon, the political thought of the ancient republican theorist Livy. And Machiavelli's theorizing about the republic revitalizes civic republicanism as a kind of ideological system. But in fact, civic republicanism in Italy wasn't to endure politically. Princes would take over cities and empires would subject city-states to their rule. But the Renaissance, from the rebirth of Roman law, the integration of Aristotle into systems of Christian thought, the rediscovery of political thinkers like Cicero and Livy, was a crucial moment in the rebirth of ancient ways of thinking. And nowhere would the revival of these ancient ways of thought, and indeed their transformation, be more apparent than in England. 17th century England was destined to become the crucible of modern political thought. 17th century England is one of the most extraordinary moments in all of history. We see in 17th century England a scientific revolution. We see the beginnings of the Enlightenment. We see the beginnings of an economic transformation that will result in the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution. England would become the site of the most extraordinary thinking about the nature of politics, about the nature of law and justice that the world had indeed ever seen. But the English context would be very different from the ancient Mediterranean world of city-states and empires, of free citizens. The English world is one of kings, one of parliament, one of the common law. Nevertheless, in this world, we would see a revival of ancient ways of political thought, but also fundamental transformations. And the crucible for this new age of political thought is the English Revolution that lasts from 1642 to 1651, and which indeed sees the death of a king, Charles I, who is killed by revolutionary forces, who temporarily overthrow the kingdom and establish parliamentary sovereignty, who rule in the name of the people and who claim to have established a commonwealth, which is nothing other than an English translation of res publica, the republic. The English Civil War in the middle of the 17th century produces political thought that will justify the rebellion and that will criticize the rebellion. And it was the English Civil War that would give birth not only to a new and English republicanism, which, like the old Roman republicanism, would say that we can only be free if we live without a king, if we live in a self-governing community of virtue, but would also give rise to new justifications for state power, for sovereignty, for kingship. And no political philosopher was more powerful or more persuasive in his doctrine of sovereignty than the defender of royal power, Thomas Hobbes.